So now that we've confirmed that our refactoring works as we expected, the next step is to reintegrate our app with user defaults so that we can try and persist our item objects using user defaults. So now let's delete this line of code where we were using to debug previously, and let's reactivate our defaults to try and retrieve our items out of our item array. So before we do that, we have to make a few fixes, of course, because we're no longer retrieving an array of strings, but we're retrieving an array of items. Now, there's nothing to change here when we're adding items because, of course, self.defaults.set can take any object, right? Or at least theoretically. So let's see what happens when we try to run our app. Now, I'm already hinting at what's going to come, but theoretically, at this point, we are creating a new item using our class item. We're setting its title property. The done property is set to false by default here. And then we're appending the item to our item array. And then we're setting into our user defaults using the key to do list array. And then when our app loads up, we use our user defaults to pull out an array. And if you remember, user defaults.array can be an array of any type, at least theoretically, and we're using the same key as we saved it, and we're trying to pull it out as an array of items. So if that succeeds, then we set our item array to equal items. Let's go ahead and give our app a run and see what happens. So that's all working fine because we're initializing new items inside view.did_load and we're appending them to this item array. Now, the part that's interesting occurs when we first press the add button and add a new item. So let's press the add button and let's add a new item. Now, once I hit add item, something dramatic happens. And of course, you can see we've got signals, sigbart, which doesn't say anything at all. But by now, you should have seen it often enough if you're coding along, because this means that our app has crashed. And if we scroll to the top of our debug console, as always, we'll find something that's trying to tell us why our app crashed. And the reason that it's telling us is attempting to set a non-property list object using user defaults. So what does that mean? Well, do you remember how I said that user defaults is a property list? It has a whole bunch of key value pairs. So for example, you could have a key, which is to-do list array, and the value is an array of strings. But in our case, we're trying to save an array of custom item objects. Remember, our item array is an array of our own item objects. And we're trying to save that into user defaults, which it's rejecting. And it probably should reject, because by the time that you're trying to save an array of your custom objects, then you're probably misusing user defaults. So this is the extent where we can get to with user defaults. And we have to start considering a slightly better solution than using user defaults to persist data, which, if you remember, is only really intended for small pieces of data, and it's massively inefficient because it has to load up the entire plist before you can use or read any of the properties inside it. So we have to abandon ship and stop using user defaults. So I believe that it's always better to show rather than tell. And I can, of course, warn you, don't use user defaults. It's not going to be very efficient and it's not going to work in lots of cases. But I think it's better to show you when we actually try to implement it and reach its limits. So remember, don't use user defaults for anything other than basically that, right? User defaults. So volume on, volume off, volume high, volume low, these kind of small tidbits. For bigger pieces of data and for saving data into databases, we've got better tools for that. So in the next lesson, we're going to be learning about one of those tools, which is NS Coder. So I'll see you there.